I'm Tessa Martin, 29, and I was 3 months pregnant when my husband David died in a car accident. In my darkest hour, grieving and terrified about raising our baby alone, I turned to our church family for comfort. Instead, Pastor Williams looked me in the eye and said, "God is punishing you for something, Tessa. You need to search your heart and repent." Those words shattered what little faith I had left. But what I discovered about our church's finances and my husband's final actions would expose a truth that changed everything. The hospital bracelet from David's accident still sits on my nightstand. Sometimes I hold it, feeling the weight of that terrible day when everything changed. The dried blood on the plastic reminds me that some wounds never fully heal. They just teach us how to carry the pain differently. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. If you've ever felt abandoned by those who promised to stand by you, like this video, this story will remind you that sometimes the most painful betrayals lead to the most powerful transformations. David and I had what everyone called a fairy tale romance. We met at a church potluck 3 years ago. I was the new marketing coordinator at the local bank, and he was the quiet guy who handled the church's financial records with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. While other men talked loudly about sports or politics, David listened, really listened. When I mentioned struggling with my grandmother's estate paperwork, he quietly offered to help, spending hours walking me through probate procedures without expecting anything in return. Our wedding photo still hangs in the hallway, though I've been avoiding that part of the house lately. In it, we're both glowing with happiness as Pastor Williams pronounces us husband and wife. David's wearing his navy suit, the one he'd later be buried in, and I'm in my grandmother's restored lace dress. The church sanctuary looks perfect. Behind us, filled with the faces of people we trusted completely, David took his role as church treasurer seriously. Maybe too seriously. He'd spend evenings at our kitchen table, meticulously reviewing every receipt, every bank statement, every donation record. "Someone has to make sure every dollar is accounted for," he'd say, adjusting his reading glasses. "These are God's resources and people's hard-earned money. We owe them complete transparency." I used to tease him about his perfectionism, but I loved how much he cared. He'd been treasurer for 4 years when we married, and everyone respected his attention to detail. Pastor Williams often praised him publicly, calling him a man of integrity who serves with a pure heart. When I found out I was pregnant, David cried. Actually cried. We'd been trying for over a year, and the positive test felt like a miracle. He immediately started planning converting the spare room into a nursery, researching the best pediatricians, calculating how we'd adjust our budget for baby expenses. He was going to be such a wonderful father. The church family was overjoyed. When we announced the pregnancy, Sister Margaret, the church secretary, hugged me so tight, I thought she might squeeze the breath out of me. "This baby is going to be so loved," she whispered. "So incredibly loved by all of us." Those words feel like mockery now. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning. I was at work, reviewing loan applications, when the police officer's voice cut through my concentration like a blade. "Mrs. Martin, there's been an accident involving your husband's vehicle." The drive to the hospital exists in my memory as a blur of panic and desperate prayers. I kept thinking about the baby, about how stress couldn't be good for either of us, but I couldn't stop the racing thoughts. David was careful. He wore his seatbelt religiously, never texted while driving, maintained his truck like his life depended on it. The emergency room doctor's face told me everything before he spoke. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Martin. Your husband was killed instantly when his truck collided with a semi-trailer. The impact was severe. He wouldn't have suffered. As if that was supposed to comfort me, as if knowing David died instantly would somehow make the next 40 years without him bearable. Within hours, our church family surrounded me. Pastor Williams prayed over me in the hospital waiting room. Sister Margaret held my hand while I signed papers I couldn't focus on. The men organized David's truck to be towed and cleaned out his personal belongings. The women started planning meals and coordinating help with funeral arrangements. "You're not alone in this," Pastor Williams assured me, his hand on my shoulder. "We're your family too, Tessa. We'll take care of you and that precious baby." Standing there, overwhelmed by grief and terror about the future, I believed him completely. I trusted them with my broken heart and my uncertain future. I thought their love was unconditional, their support unwavering. I had no idea how wrong I was. The church women descended on my house like a well-meaning army. Within days, my refrigerator overflowed with casseroles. My counters were covered with sympathy cards, and my kitchen table had become command central for funeral planning. I should have felt grateful for their overwhelming help, but something felt off about their hovering presence. Sister Margaret organized the meal schedule with military precision, but her notes stung more than comforted. God's plan is always perfect, even when we can't understand it. She'd written on the sticky note attached to her tuna casserole, "Mrs. Henderson's green bean." Casserole came with a Bible verse about suffering building character. Even Mrs. Taylor's famous chocolate cake arrived with a reminder that all things work together for good. Each dish felt like a small sermon, a gentle correction of my grief. I started to dread mealtime, knowing that every bite came with someone else's interpretation of why my husband had to die. Pastor Williams visited daily, always with his worn leather Bible and a concerned expression. During his third visit, he sat across from me at the kitchen table where David used to balance the church books and spoke in that measured tone he used for difficult conversations. "Tessa, I need to ask you something important," he said, his fingers drumming against the table. "Is there anything David might have been struggling with? Any burdens he was carrying that you might not have known about?" The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" Sometimes men carry heavy spiritual burdens without sharing them with their wives. They try to protect us from their struggles. His eyes were kind but probing. I'm wondering if David had any unconfessed sin, any area where he might have been wrestling with temptation. I felt heat rise in my cheeks. David was a good man, Pastor Williams. He loved God and served the church faithfully. Of course, he said quickly. I'm not suggesting otherwise. But sometimes the enemy attacks our strongest warriors the hardest. I'm just trying to understand why the Lord would allow such a tragedy to touch our church family. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Even then, just days after David's death, Pastor Williams was searching for spiritual explanations that would make sense of the senseless. But his questions planted seeds of doubt that would grow into something much darker. David's mother arrived from Arizona 2 days before the funeral, and her presence added another layer of complexity to my grief. Eleanor Martin had never fully approved of me, too independent, too different from the traditional churchwomen she respected. She'd softened somewhat after our wedding, but tragedy stripped away her polite pretenses. "I don't understand why David was driving that route," she said, standing in my kitchen surrounded by the casserole dishes. "He always took the main highway. Home from work, what was he doing on that back road?" I didn't have an answer. The police report mentioned that David had been traveling on County Route 15, a winding road that added 20 minutes to his usual commute. It was a detail that bothered me too, but grief has a way of making everything seem significant and meaningless at the same time. "Maybe he was running an errand," I suggested weakly. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "What kind of errand? For who?" I wanted to tell her I didn't know, that I was asking the same questions, but her accusatory tone made me defensive. "I'm sure he had his reasons." "David always had reasons," she said, but her voice carried an edge that made me wonder what she meant. The funeral service was held on a grey Thursday morning. The church was packed. David had been loved by many people, and his sudden death shocked the entire community. Pastor Williams delivered a eulogy that praised David's service and faithfulness, but even there, subtle questions crept in. "We don't always understand why the Lord calls his servants home," Pastor Williams said from the pulpit, "but we trust that his purposes are higher than our own." Sometimes he removes people from situations they're not equipped to handle. Sometimes he protects them from challenges that would be too great for their faith. The words felt like puzzle pieces that didn't quite fit together. Protect them from what? What challenges? I sat in the front row, David's mother rigid beside me, and felt the weight of hundreds of eyes on my back. Were they looking at me with pity, or were they also wondering about the unspoken questions Pastor Williams kept raising? After the service, people hugged me and whispered condolences, but I caught fragments of hushed conversations that made my stomach clench. Such a young man to be taken so suddenly. Makes you wonder what the Lord was protecting him from. Sometimes, God knows things we don't know. By the time everyone left the cemetery, I felt more alone than ever. The church family that had promised to support me was already creating distance, already building explanations that somehow made David's death about hidden spiritual failures rather than random tragedy. That night, I sat in our bedroom holding the stack of sympathy cards, and I couldn't shake the feeling that comfort was quickly turning into something else. The casserole dishes in my kitchen weren't just acts of service. They were assignments. Reminders that I was now the recipient of charity rather than an equal member of the church family. I was becoming their project, their cautionary tale, their puzzle to solve. And I was starting to realize that their love came with conditions I was only beginning to understand. 2 weeks after David's funeral, I forced myself to attend Sunday morning service. The house felt too quiet, too empty, and I thought being around people who claimed to love me might help ease the crushing loneliness. I was wrong. I arrived a few minutes late, hoping to slip into the back row unnoticed, but Sister Margaret immediately guided me to the front, her arm around my shoulders in a display of care that felt more like performance than genuine comfort. "You belong up here with us," she whispered, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. Pastor Williams took the pulpit wearing his navy suit and the grave expression he reserved for serious sermons. The bulletin in my hands announced the morning's message, "When God Disciplines His Children." My hands trembled as I read the title, a cold dread settling in my stomach. "Today we're going to talk about a difficult truth," Pastor Williams began, his voice carrying across the sanctuary. "Sometimes, when tragedy strikes, we want to cry out, 'Why me?' or 'Why us?' But God's word teaches us that He disciplines those He loves. Every trial, every loss, every season of suffering serves a purpose in the life of a believer." He opened his Bible and read from Hebrews 12, "My son, do not make light of the Lord's discipline, and do not lose heart when He rebukes you. Because the Lord disciplines the one He loves, and He chastens everyone He accepts as His son." I could feel the weight of the congregation's attention on me. This wasn't a general sermon about suffering. This was specifically about my situation, my loss, my grief. Pastor Williams was using David's death as a teaching moment, and I was trapped in the front row, forced to listen to his spiritual interpretation of my tragedy. "Now, I want to be very clear," he continued, making eye contact with me briefly, before looking away. "I'm not suggesting that anyone deserves tragedy, but Scripture is clear that God uses difficult circumstances to refine us, to reveal areas in our lives that need His cleansing touch. When we lose someone suddenly, it's natural to wonder what lessons the Lord wants us to learn." The sermon continued for 30 more minutes, each point hammering home the message that tragedy always serves a divine purpose. That sudden death often protects people from greater spiritual failures, that survivors should examine their hearts for hidden sin that might have contributed to their loss. I sat frozen in my seat, my hands protecting my growing belly, as Pastor Williams essentially preached that David's death was somehow connected to spiritual problems in our marriage or our lives. By the time he finished, I felt more alone than I had since the accident. After the service, I tried to leave quickly, but Pastor Williams intercepted me in the lobby. "Tessa, could I speak with you privately for a moment?" We walked to his office, a wood-paneled room lined with theological books and framed certificates. He closed the door and gestured for me to sit in the chair across from his desk. "The same," desk where David had met with him monthly to review church finances. "I hope my sermon didn't upset you," he said, though his tone suggested he knew it had. I felt led by the Spirit to address some things that have been weighing on my heart. "It felt like you were talking about David and me specifically," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Pastor Williams leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. "Tessa, I've been praying about your situation, and I believe the Lord has shown me something important. This tragedy, David's death, it's not random. God doesn't allow things to happen without purpose." My heart was racing now, adrenaline mixing with grief and confusion. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that God is trying to get your attention. Something in your life, or in David's life, needed to be addressed. The Lord is disciplining you, and until you understand why, you're going to continue to struggle." The words hit me like a physical blow. "You think God killed my husband to punish me?" "I think God allowed David to be taken because he's calling you to repentance." Pastor Williams' voice was gentle but firm. "You need to search your heart, Tessa. You need to ask the Lord to reveal what he wants you to confess. What hidden sin might have brought this judgment on your family?" I stared at him, unable to process what I was hearing. This man who had married us, who had prayed over our pregnancy announcement, who had comforted me at the hospital, was now telling me that God had killed my husband as some kind of divine punishment. "I don't understand," I whispered. "Pride, perhaps," he suggested. "David was very successful for a young man. Sometimes the Lord humbles those who are becoming too comfortable in their worldly achievements. Or maybe there were issues in your marriage that you haven't been honest about. Areas where you weren't submitting to your husband's leadership." Each suggestion felt like a dagger to my heart. I thought about David's gentleness, his faithfulness, his excitement about becoming a father. I thought about our prayers together, our shared commitment to serving God, our genuine love for each other. "David was a good man," I said, my voice stronger now. "He loved God and served this church faithfully." "Of course he was a good man," Pastor Williams replied. "But even good men can be led astray. Even faithful servants can develop blind spots. The fact that he was taken so suddenly suggests there were things the Lord needed to address before they became bigger problems." I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor. "I need to go. Tessa, I'm trying to help you. Until you're willing to face whatever God wants you to face, you're going to remain under his discipline. Your baby's future depends on you getting right with the Lord." The threat was subtle but clear. Even my unborn child was somehow at risk because of my supposed spiritual failures. I walked out of his office and through the church lobby, aware that conversations stopped as I passed. Everyone knew I'd been called in for a private meeting with the pastor. Everyone was watching to see how I'd respond to his spiritual guidance. I made it to my car before the tears started. Sitting in the church parking lot, I realized that the people I'd trusted most in the world had decided that my tragedy was somehow my fault. They weren't grieving with me. They were judging me, examining me, waiting for me to confess to sins I didn't know I'd committed. That night, I took down the church bulletin and read the sermon title again. When God Disciplines His Children. I folded it carefully and put it in the drawer with David's personal effects. Someday, I thought, I might need to remember exactly what they said to me in my darkest hour. I had no idea how important that piece of paper would become. After Pastor Williams' devastating conversation, I stopped attending church services, but I couldn't stop thinking about his accusations. If David had been hiding something, if there were spiritual problems I'd been blind to, wouldn't there be evidence? David was meticulous about everything. Surely any struggles would have left traces in his papers, his computer, his daily routines. 3 weeks after the funeral, I finally gathered the courage to tackle David's financial records. As the church treasurer, he'd kept detailed files both for the church and for our personal finances. His home office was a small converted bedroom where he'd spent countless evenings, balancing accounts and preparing monthly reports. Sitting at his desk, I felt his presence so strongly it took my breath away. Everything was exactly as he'd left it, his reading glasses folded on top of a stack of bank statements, his coffee mug still unwashed, sitting next to his computer keyboard. His neat handwriting filling the margins of various documents with notes and calculations. David's organizational system was impressive. He had separate filing cabinets for church finances, personal finances, and what he called reference materials, tax documents, insurance policies, warranties, and investment records. Each file was labeled in his careful script, each document stored in chronological order. I started with our personal accounts, thinking I'd find evidence of financial stress or hidden debts that might explain Pastor Williams' suggestions about worldly pride. Instead, I found exactly what I expected: careful budgeting, modest spending, and a small but growing savings account intended for the baby's future expenses. Then I moved to the church files, and that's where things became interesting. David had been meticulous about tracking every dollar that flowed through the church accounts. Donation records, expense reports, budget projections, bank statements, everything was documented and cross-referenced. But as I studied the papers, I noticed something odd. David had been making notes in the margins, and his handwriting became more urgent and pointed as the months progressed. On a bank statement from 6 months ago, he'd written, "Building fund deposit doesn't match collected amount $2,847 discrepancy." 3 months later, another note, "Third month of unexplained shortfalls, need to verify with bank records." And just a month before his death, "Pattern is clear, someone is skimming." My hands shook as I read his notes. David had discovered financial irregularities at the church, and he'd been investigating them systematically. The more I studied his records, the clearer the picture became. Someone had been stealing from the church's building fund, and David had been quietly documenting the theft. I needed to see the bank statements firsthand. The next morning, I drove to First National Bank, where David had maintained both our personal accounts and the church's operating accounts. Mr. Peterson, the bank manager, had known David for years and greeted me with genuine sympathy. "Mrs. Martin, I'm so sorry for your loss. David was one of our most valued customers, always professional, always thorough. How can I help you today?" I explained that I needed to review the church account statements as part of settling David's affairs as treasurer. Mr. Peterson looked uncomfortable. "Well, actually, that's complicated. Pastor Williams came in last week and removed David's name from the account. Said he'd be handling the church finances personally until they could find a replacement treasurer." The information hit me like a cold wave. "When exactly did he do this? Let me check." Mr. Peterson pulled up the computer records. It was Monday morning, the day after David's funeral. First thing when we opened. Pastor Williams had moved quickly to take control of the church finances before anyone could review David's records. The timing felt deliberate, calculated. I thought about his probing questions about David's possible spiritual struggles, his suggestions that David might have been hiding something. Had he been projecting his own guilt onto David? "Mr. Peterson," I said carefully, "did David ever express any concerns about the church accounts? Any questions about discrepancies or irregularities?" The bank manager glanced around the office, then leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Martin, I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but David was here just 2 days before the accident. He was asking about procedures for reporting suspected embezzlement. He seemed very concerned about some patterns he'd noticed." My heart pounded. "What kind of patterns?" "Regular cash withdrawals that didn't match the church's documented expenses. David said he'd been tracking them for months, and they always seemed to coincide with periods when Pastor Williams was handling deposits personally." I felt like I was putting together a puzzle with pieces I didn't want to fit. David hadn't been struggling with hidden sins. He'd been struggling with the discovery that his pastor, his spiritual leader, was stealing from the church. The man who was now telling me that God had killed my husband as punishment for unconfessed sin was actually the one with secrets to hide. Did David mention what he planned to do with this information? I asked. Mr. Peterson nodded. He was scheduled to meet with our fraud investigation team next week. He said he wanted to have all the evidence documented before he approached the church board next week. David had been planning to expose Pastor Williams' theft when he was killed. The timing of his death suddenly seemed less like random tragedy and more like terrible irony or something worse. I left the bank with a sickening realization. Pastor Williams hadn't just been cruel to me in my grief. He'd been actively covering up the very crimes that David had died trying to expose. While I was being told to search my heart for hidden sins, the real sin was being committed by the man demanding my repentance. That afternoon, I spread David's financial records across our kitchen table and began to see the full scope of what he discovered. The pattern was clear once I knew what to look for. Over the past 2 years, approximately $30,000 had been systematically stolen from the church's building fund through a combination of inflated expense reports, fake invoices, and direct cash withdrawals. David had been building a comprehensive case against Pastor Williams, documenting every discrepancy, every suspicious transaction, every lie told to the congregation about the building fund's progress. My husband hadn't been hiding spiritual failures. He'd been preparing to expose them. And now, Pastor Williams was using David's death to convince me that I was the one with something to confess. The manipulation was breathtaking in its cruelty. He wasn't just stealing money. He was stealing my grief, my faith, my sense of reality itself. I sat alone at the kitchen table, surrounded by evidence of my husband's integrity and my pastor's corruption, and I realized that David's death hadn't been God's judgment on our family. It had been the tragic end of a good man's fight for truth and justice. The question now was what I was going to do about it. The discovery of David's investigation into Pastor Williams' embezzlement left me reeling, but it also filled me with a fierce determination to finish what my husband had started. If David had been building a case against the pastor, there had to be more evidence somewhere. I just had to find it. I spent the next day searching through David's office more systematically, looking for anything I might have missed. In the bottom drawer of his filing cabinet, tucked behind old tax returns, I found a manila folder labeled Church Building Project Reference Materials. Inside were architectural plans for the proposed church expansion, contractor estimates, and a timeline that dated back 3 years. What caught my attention were David's handwritten notes comparing the amounts reported to the congregation versus the actual costs documented in bank records. The discrepancies were staggering. Pastor Williams had been telling the church that the building fund needed $150,000 for the expansion project, but the actual contractor estimates totaled only $87,000. Where was the additional $63,000 supposed to go? David had also documented meetings and conversations, noting dates and direct quotes. One entry from 2 months before his death read, asked PW about Maya construction invoice claims. It was for foundation prep work, but no work has been done on church property. Invoice appears to be fabricated. Another note, dated just 3 weeks before the accident, PW becoming defensive when questioned about expenses, suggested I was overstepping my role as treasurer, beginning to think confrontation is inevitable. The final entry made my blood run cold. Meeting scheduled with bank fraud debt next Tuesday. Will present complete documentation. Praying for wisdom and courage to do what's right for the church family next Tuesday. David had been killed on Monday night, less than 12 hours before his scheduled meeting with the bank's fraud investigators. I sat back in David's chair, overwhelmed by the implications. My husband had been murdered, maybe not intentionally, but certainly conveniently. The timing was too perfect, too coincidental. Pastor Williams had eliminated the one person who could expose his crimes, and then he'd had the audacity to blame me for bringing God's judgment on our family. But David had been too thorough to keep all his evidence in one place. If he was planning to present documentation to bank investigators, he would have had backup copies. I turned to his computer, a laptop he'd password protected, but never hidden from me. He'd always used the same password. Our wedding date followed by my initials, The computer unlocked on my first try, and I felt David's presence so strongly I almost spoke aloud to him. His desktop was as organized as his physical files, with folders clearly labeled for different areas of responsibility. I found the church folder and clicked it open. Inside were dozens of spreadsheets, scanned documents, and something that made my heart race, a folder labeled EM Investigation, with a date from last week, M, Embezzlement Investigation. The folder contained comprehensive documentation of Pastor Williams' theft going back nearly 3 years. David had tracked every suspicious transaction, cross-referenced every discrepancy, and even researched the legal penalties for non-profit embezzlement. He'd created a timeline showing how the theft had escalated from small amounts to increasingly bold thefts totaling thousands of dollars per month. But the most damning evidence was in a subfolder labeled Audio Files. David had been secretly recording his conversations with Pastor Williams about the financial discrepancies. My hands trembled as I opened the first file, dated 6 weeks before David's death. David, I appreciate your attention to detail, but I think you're making this more complicated than it needs to be. Pastor Williams' voice came through the computer speakers. The building fund is complex, with multiple phases and unexpected expenses. Not everything needs to be documented to the penny. But Pastor, the congregation deserves transparency, David replied, his voice calm but firm. They're giving sacrificially because they believe in this project. If we can't account for where their money is going, are you questioning my integrity, David? The edge in Pastor Williams' voice was unmistakable, because that's what this sounds like. I've been leading this church for 15 years. I think I know how to handle church finances. I'm not questioning your integrity, David said carefully. I'm just trying to reconcile some discrepancies in the building fund account. The numbers don't add up, and I'm concerned. What you should be concerned about is overstepping your role, Pastor Williams interrupted. The treasurer's job is to record transactions, not investigate the pastor's financial decisions. I think you need to pray about your attitude, David. Pride can be a dangerous thing, especially for young men who think they know better than their elders. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Pastor Williams becoming increasingly defensive and accusatory while David remained respectful but persistent. By the end of the recording, it was clear that Pastor Williams was threatened by David's questions and was already laying groundwork to discredit him. There were 5 more audio files, each documenting escalating tension between David and Pastor Williams. In the final recording, made just 4 days before David's death, the pastor's tone had shifted from defensive to menacing. David, I'm going to say this one more time. Drop this investigation of yours. You're stirring up trouble where none exists, and you're going to damage this church's reputation. If you can't trust your pastor's leadership, maybe you should consider whether this is the right church for your family. Are you asking us to leave? David's voice was steady, but I could hear the strain underneath. I'm asking you to be very careful about the accusations you're making. False witnesses don't fare well in God's kingdom. David, and pregnant wives don't need the stress of their husbands being exposed as troublemakers. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Pastor Williams was warning David to back down or face consequences that would affect me and our unborn baby. David had been trying to protect the church, and Pastor Williams had responded by threatening our family. I sat in David's office, listening to my deceased husband's voice defend our church's integrity, while our pastor threatened him into silence. And I understood the full scope of what I was dealing with. Pastor Williams wasn't just a thief, he was a manipulator who would destroy anyone who threatened his carefully constructed image. The encrypted USB drive I found in David's desk drawer contained copies of everything: financial records, audio, files, photographs of documents, and a detailed report he'd been preparing for the bank's fraud investigators. He'd even researched the legal process for reporting embezzlement and had identified 3 other churches where Pastor Williams had previously served and left under mysterious circumstances. My husband had been building an airtight case against a career criminal who had been using the trust of faithful congregations to fund his personal lifestyle. David had died trying to protect people who were now blaming me for his death. As I saved copies of everything to my own computer, I realized that David's investigation had revealed more than financial crimes. It had exposed the true character of the man who was now telling me to repent for bringing God's judgment on my family. Pastor Williams hadn't just stolen money, he'd stolen lives, trust, faith, and hope. He'd turned my grief into guilt, my loss into shame, my tragedy into his opportunity for control. But David had left me the tools to finish what he'd started. The question was whether I had the courage to use them. Armed with David's evidence against Pastor Williams, I faced a harsh reality. I was 5 months pregnant, financially stressed, and completely alone in my fight for justice. The church family that had once surrounded me with support had withdrawn their help the moment I stopped attending services and accepting Pastor Williams' spiritual guidance. The medical bills began arriving in earnest during my second trimester. David's employer-provided insurance had ended 30 days after his death, and my own coverage through the bank was basic at best. High-risk pregnancy monitoring, specialist consultations, and additional testing due to stress-related complications were creating a mountain of debt I couldn't manage on my salary alone. I'd foolishly expected the church to help with these expenses. During David's tenure as treasurer, we'd seen the congregation rally around families facing medical crises, setting up special offerings and providing practical support. But when I quietly approached Sister Margaret about the possibility of assistance with prenatal care costs, her response was ice cold. "Tessa, the church board has discussed your situation," she said, not meeting my eyes. "While we're certainly praying for you and the baby, we feel that your current attitude toward pastoral authority makes it inappropriate for us to provide financial support. Pastor Williams believes that helping you right now would be enabling your rebellion against God's discipline." The message was clear. Submit to Pastor Williams' narrative about my supposed spiritual failures, or face the consequences alone. They were using my financial vulnerability to force my compliance with their version of events. My pregnancy was becoming increasingly complicated. Due to stress and grief, Dr. Rodriguez, my obstetrician, expressed concern about my blood pressure and weight loss. During my 20-week appointment, she sat across from her desk with a worried expression. "Tessa, I need to be direct with you. The stress you're experiencing is affecting your pregnancy. Your blood pressure is elevated, you're not gaining weight appropriately, and the baby's measurements are slightly concerning. You need to find ways to reduce the stress in your life, or we could be looking at serious complications." I wanted to tell her that my stress wasn't something I could simply manage away. I was carrying the weight of my husband's murder, the church's abandonment, financial pressure, and the knowledge that a criminal was using my grief to cover his crimes. But how do you explain that to someone who doesn't understand the spiritual and emotional warfare involved? "Is there family support available to you?" Dr. Rodriguez asked gently. "Friends who can help? Community resources?" David's mother had returned to Arizona immediately after the funeral, making it clear that she blamed me for whatever circumstances had led to her son's death. My own parents lived across the country and had their own health issues that prevented them from providing hands-on support. The friends I thought I had were all connected to the church and had chosen sides Pastor Williams' side. "I'm managing," I lied, knowing that she could see through my facade. Dr. Diaz prescribed bed rest for several hours each day and recommended that I consider counseling to help process my grief. The counseling sounded helpful, but it was another expense I couldn't afford. The bed rest felt like a luxury I couldn't manage while working full-time and handling all of David's remaining financial obligations. The isolation was the hardest part. Davao isn't a large town, and the church had been the center of our social life. Running errands became exercises in awkward encounters with former church friends, who either avoided eye contact or offered superficial pleasantries that barely masked their judgment. At the grocery store, I ran into Mrs. Henderson, who had made the green bean casserole with the note about suffering building character. She looked genuinely uncomfortable when she saw me, her eyes darting to my growing belly and then away. "Tessa, how are you doing?" she asked, but her tone suggested she didn't really want to know. "I'm managing, thank you." "We've been praying for you," she said, which felt more like a threat than comfort. "Pastor Williams says you're going through a difficult spiritual season. We're all hoping you'll find your way back to the church family soon." "I appreciate the prayers," I replied carefully, not trusting myself to say more. "The baby needs a church family," she continued, her voice taking on a slightly lecturing tone. "Children need spiritual stability, especially children who will grow up without fathers. You don't want to deprive your child of God's blessings because of your own spiritual struggles." The manipulation was breathtaking. She was suggesting that my unborn child would suffer spiritually because I wasn't submitting to Pastor Williams' authority. Even my baby's eternal welfare was being used as leverage to force my compliance. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by medical bills, bank statements, and David's evidence against Pastor Williams. The contrast was stark piles of legitimate expenses I couldn't afford versus documentation of thousands of dollars stolen from people who trusted their pastor. The injustice of it burned in my chest like acid reflux. I thought about David's courage in pursuing the truth despite Pastor Williams' threats. He'd known the personal cost of exposing the pastor's crimes, but he'd been willing to pay it because he believed the church family deserved honesty and transparency. Now that same church family was punishing me for refusing to accept lies about my husband's character and my own spiritual condition. The baby kicked for the first time that night, a small flutter that reminded me I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. This child deserved to know the truth about their father, that David Martin had been a man of integrity who died trying to protect people from a predator. This baby deserved a world where truth mattered more than convenient lies, where justice was possible even for ordinary people without power or influence. I made a decision that night, sitting alone in my kitchen with David's evidence spread before me, and our child moving in my womb. I was going to finish what David started, regardless of the personal cost. I was going to expose Pastor Williams' crimes and clear my husband's name, even if it meant facing the battle completely alone. The church had abandoned me, but they'd underestimated me. They saw a grieving pregnant widow who could be manipulated into silence. They didn't see the strength that comes from having nothing left to lose, or the fury that builds when someone uses your love against you. Pastor Williams had made a critical error in his psychological warfare against me. He'd assumed that isolation would break my spirit and force my submission. Instead, it had clarified my purpose and steeled my resolve. I was going to take him down, and I was going to do it with the very evidence my husband had died collecting. David's death wouldn't be in vain, and our child would grow up knowing that their father had been a hero who stood against corruption even when it cost him everything. The lonely battle was just beginning, but I was ready to fight it. 3 days after my resolve crystallized into action, I found a handwritten note slipped under my front door. The paper was simple, the handwriting careful and deliberate. "You're not alone. David was right. If you want the truth, meet me at Corner Cafe tomorrow at 2 p.m. I'll be wearing a red scarf." A friend. My hands shook as I read the note. Someone else knew about David's investigation. Someone else believed he'd been right about Pastor Williams. After weeks of isolation and manipulation, the possibility of an ally felt almost too good to be true. The next afternoon, I arrived at Corner Cafe 15 minutes early, my nerves stretched tight with anticipation and fear. What if this was a trap? What if Pastor Williams was testing my loyalty by sending someone to pretend to support me? But as I sat in a corner booth with a clear view of the entrance, I realized I'd reached a point where even the risk of betrayal was worth the chance of finding someone who believed David's version of events. At exactly 2 p.m., Sister Margaret walked through the cafe door wearing a red scarf. My initial shock gave way to suspicion. Margaret had been one of Pastor Williams' most loyal supporters, one of the church members who delivered casseroles with passive-aggressive Bible verses. She'd been the one to tell me that the church board wouldn't provide financial assistance because of my rebellion against pastoral authority. Seeing her as my mysterious ally felt impossible. She spotted me immediately and approached the table with visible nervousness, glancing around the cafe as if she expected to be followed. When she sat down across from me, her usual composed demeanor was replaced by something I'd never seen from her before: genuine fear. "Tessa, I know you have no reason to trust me," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know how I've treated you since David died, and I'm ashamed of myself. But I couldn't stand by and watch what's happening to you anymore." "What do you mean?" I asked, still wary of a trap. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I've worked for that church for 12 years. I've seen things that I convinced myself to ignore. But when Pastor Williams started blaming you for David's death, when he started saying God was punishing you for hidden sins, I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore." She reached into her purse and pulled out a manila envelope. "David came to me 3 weeks before he died. He asked me to keep copies of some documents in my personal files, said he was concerned about the church's financial records, and wanted to make sure there were backup copies in case anything happened to his computer." My heart raced. What kind of documents? Bank statements, receipts, correspondence with contractors. David said he'd discovered discrepancies in the building fund and was worried that someone might try to destroy evidence if his investigation became public. Margaret slid the envelope across the table. "He made me promise that if anything happened to him, I would make sure these documents reached the proper authorities." I opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside were photocopies of the same financial records I'd found on David's computer, but also additional documentation I hadn't seen before: bank deposit slips that showed regular transfers from the church building fund to a personal account belonging to Pastor Williams. "How long have you known about this?" I asked. Margaret's face crumpled. "I've suspected for over a year, but I told myself there had to be innocent explanations. Pastors sometimes handle money in ways that seem irregular to lay people. That David's investigation made it impossible to deny what was really happening." She wiped her eyes with a tissue, then continued. "After David died and Pastor Williams started controlling the narrative about your spiritual condition, I realized he was using your grief to cover up his crimes. When he convinced the church board to withdraw financial support from you while he's been stealing thousands of dollars, I couldn't be part of it anymore. Are there others who know the truth?" I asked. "More than you might think," Margaret replied. "The Henderson family left the church last month. They never said why publicly, but Mrs. Henderson told me privately that her husband had questions about where the building fund money was really going. The Thompsons stopped tithing 6 months ago when Pastor Williams couldn't provide clear answers about the construction timeline." She leaned forward, her voice gaining strength. "There's a pattern, Tessa. Pastor Williams isolates anyone who asks difficult questions. He makes them feel like spiritual failures, like their concerns come from pride or rebellion. But David wasn't the first person to notice the financial irregularities. He was just the most thorough in documenting them." The revelation that David hadn't been alone in his suspicions changed everything. If other families had left the church over financial concerns, it meant Pastor Williams' crimes were becoming harder to hide. It also meant there were potential witnesses and allies I hadn't known about. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. Margaret's expression hardened with determination I'd never seen from her before. "Because what he's doing to you is evil. Using your husband's death to shame you into silence while he steals from the people who trust him. It's the worst kind of spiritual abuse. David died trying to protect our church family from a predator, and that predator is now using David's death to continue his crimes." She reached across the table and took my hand. "I've been secretary of that church for 12 years. I have access to financial records, correspondence, meeting minutes, everything. If you're willing to finish what David started, I'll help you, but we need to be careful. Pastor Williams is dangerous when he feels threatened." "Dangerous how?" I asked, thinking about the timing of David's accident. Margaret hesitated, then spoke in barely audible whispers. I don't think David's accident was random. Tessa, the route he was traveling that night makes no sense unless he was meeting someone. The timing just hours before his scheduled meeting. With the bank investigators, it's all too convenient. The words hung between us like a loaded gun. Neither of us was willing to say outright that we suspected Pastor Williams of murder, but the implication was clear. David's death had solved too many problems for the pastor for it to be mere coincidence. What do you think we should do? I asked. Finish David's investigation, but more carefully than he did, Margaret replied. Don't confront Pastor Williams directly. Don't give him any warning that we're onto him. Gather all the evidence we can, then take it to the authorities all at once. She stood to leave, then turned back to me. Tessa, I'm sorry for how I treated you after David died. I was scared and confused, and I let Pastor Williams manipulate me into blaming you instead of supporting you. You deserve better from all of us. After Margaret left, I sat in the cafe for another hour, processing everything she'd told me. For the first time since David's death, I didn't feel completely alone. I had an ally who understood the scope of Pastor Williams' crimes and was willing to risk her own position in the church to help expose them. But Margaret's warning about Pastor Williams being dangerous echoed in my mind. If he was willing to kill to protect his secrets, what would he do when he realized that David's widow and the church secretary were working together to finish David's investigation? I thought about my unborn child and the risks I was taking by pursuing this fight. But then I thought about David's voice on those recordings, calmly and courageously confronting corruption despite threats to our family. My husband had been willing to risk everything for the truth. I could do no less for him, for our child, and for the church family that deserved better than the predator who was exploiting their faith for personal gain. Working with Margaret transformed my isolated investigation into a systematic operation where I had David's thorough documentation. She had insider access to church records and institutional memory spanning over a decade. Together, we began building a comprehensive case that would be impossible for Pastor Williams to dismiss or explain away. Our first meeting took place in Margaret's modest home, a comfortable space filled with religious artwork and family photos. She'd prepared for our collaboration by gathering years of financial documents, board meeting minutes, and correspondence that painted a disturbing picture of Pastor Williams' escalating criminal behavior. I brought the original building fund ledger, Margaret said, placing a thick bound book on her kitchen table. This is what David was asking about in those final weeks. The discrepancies between what's recorded here and what actually happened are staggering. The ledger was a revelation. In Pastor Williams' own handwriting, recorded donations totaled over $89,000 for the building project. But when Margaret showed me the actual bank deposits, only $52,000 had ever reached the church account. The difference, $37,000, had simply vanished. Where did the missing money go? I asked. Margaret produced another set of documents, bank statements for an account I'd never seen before. Pastor Williams opened a separate account 2 years ago, supposedly for project management expenses. Look at the deposit dates and amounts. The pattern was unmistakable. Every time significant building fund donations were collected, a portion would be deposited into Pastor Williams' special account rather than the church's main building fund. The account had been used to pay for personal expenses, car payments, credit card bills, even what appeared to be vacation rentals. He's been stealing for at least 2 years, I said, feeling sick as I added up the documented theft. Longer than that, Margaret replied grimly. I started paying attention to irregularities about 3 years ago, but I found evidence going back to when he first arrived at our church. Small amounts at first, maybe a few $100s here and there. But as people trusted him more, as the building fund grew, he became bolder. She showed me correspondence between Pastor Williams and various contractors, documents that revealed another layer of fraud. Invoices had been created for work that was never performed, with checks written to fake companies that traced back to accounts controlled by Pastor Williams himself. Meyer Construction, Williams Building Solutions, PW Development, they're all shell companies, Margaret explained. I ran the addresses and they all trace back to a post office box that Pastor Williams rents under an assumed name. The scope of the operation was breathtaking. This wasn't just embezzlement. It was organized fraud spanning multiple years and involving sophisticated money laundering techniques. Pastor Williams had been running a criminal enterprise while preaching about honesty and stewardship to his congregation. How did David figure all this out? I asked. He started asking questions about why the building project kept getting delayed, despite adequate funding, Margaret said. When Pastor Williams couldn't provide satisfactory answers, David requested copies of all financial records. That's when he discovered the discrepancies between reported donations and actual account balances. She pulled out a folder containing David's original requests for financial documentation, formal written, requests that showed how professional and methodical he'd been in his investigation. Pastor Williams had tried to delay and deflect, but David had persisted with quiet determination. Look at this, Margaret said, showing me a letter David had written to Pastor Williams just 2 weeks before his death. He was giving him one final chance to explain the irregularities before taking the matter to the church board. The letter was diplomatic but firm, requesting a private meeting to discuss significant concerns about building fund management. David had offered Pastor Williams an opportunity to come clean, to admit his mistakes and make restitution. Instead, Pastor Williams had responded by threatening David's family and questioning his spiritual condition. He tried to do the right thing, I said, my voice thick with emotion. Even after he discovered the theft, David tried to handle it through proper channels. He gave Pastor Williams every opportunity to confess and make things right. That's who your husband was, Margaret said gently. Even when he knew he was dealing with a criminal, he hoped for redemption rather than destruction. Pastor Williams repaid that grace by turning the congregation against you after David's death. We spent the next 3 hours organizing David's evidence with Margaret's additional documentation, creating a timeline that showed how Pastor Williams' crimes had escalated over time. The pattern was clear. Each time someone asked questions or expressed concerns, they either left the church voluntarily or were pushed out through spiritual manipulation. The Henderson family wasn't the first to leave under suspicious circumstances, Margaret revealed. 3 years ago, James Cooper raised questions about discrepancies in the missions fund. Within 2 months, Pastor Williams had convinced the congregation that James was struggling with pride and rebellion. The family left after Pastor Williams preached a sermon about wolves in sheep's clothing that was clearly targeting James. How many families have been driven away? I asked. At least 6 that I can document. Probably more that I don't know about, Margaret replied. Pastor Williams has been systematically eliminating anyone who might expose his crimes. The congregation has been trained to view questions about church finances as spiritual attacks rather than legitimate oversight. The psychological manipulation was as sophisticated as the financial fraud. Pastor Williams had created a culture where questioning his authority was equated with questioning God's authority, where concerns about money were reframed as evidence of spiritual immaturity. He turned the congregation into unwitting accomplices by making them feel guilty for having doubts about their pastor's behavior. What made you finally decide to act? I asked Margaret. She was quiet for a long moment, then spoke with obvious pain. When Pastor Williams told you that God had killed David as punishment for your sins, I realized I was watching pure evil disguised as spiritual authority. David died trying to protect our church family, and Pastor Williams was using his death to continue victimizing people. I couldn't be complicit in that anymore. We made copies of everything: financial records, correspondence, meeting minutes, bank statements. Margaret kept the originals in her personal files, while I took copies home to add to David's evidence. Together, we had documented over $75,000 in theft and fraud spanning nearly 4 years. But the money was only part of the crime. Pastor Williams had stolen trust, faith, community, and hope from dozens of families. He'd driven away good people who dared to ask honest questions. He'd manipulated grief and spirituality to cover his tracks. He'd turned a house of worship into a criminal enterprise. As I drove home that evening, I felt the weight of responsibility for bringing justice to all the families Pastor Williams had victimized. David's investigation had been about protecting our church, but Margaret's assistance had revealed that the crimes extended far beyond what my husband had discovered. The baby kicked as I pulled into my driveway, a reminder that I was fighting not just for David's memory, but for the future. This child deserved to grow up in a world where truth mattered, where predators couldn't hide behind religious authority, where good people like David weren't silenced by those they tried to protect. I had the evidence. I had an ally. Now, I needed a plan to expose Pastor Williams without giving him an opportunity to destroy evidence, flee, or hurt anyone else who threatened his carefully constructed lies. The next phase of our investigation would be the most dangerous, but also the most crucial. We were about to take on a man who had proven he would do anything to protect his secrets, including, possibly, murder. The stress of investigating Pastor Williams' crimes while managing pregnancy complications and financial pressure finally caught up with me during my 24th week. I was at home, organizing copies of financial documents Margaret had provided, when sharp pains in my abdomen sent me into a panic. The cramping was unlike anything I'd experienced during my pregnancy, intense, rhythmic, and accompanied by spotting. That terrified me. I called Dr. Rodriguez's emergency line, and her nurse instructed me to come to the hospital immediately, driving myself to the emergency room. While experiencing what felt like early labor was one of the most frightening experiences of my life. Every traffic light seemed endless. Every turn sent fresh waves of pain through my body, and I couldn't stop thinking about losing the baby, losing the last piece of David I had left. The emergency room staff took me seriously when I explained my symptoms and gestational age. Within minutes, I was in a hospital bed with monitors attached to my belly, listening to my baby's heartbeat and watching the patterns that would tell us whether I was actually in premature labor. Dr. Rodriguez arrived within an hour, her face showing the concern I'd seen growing over the past several weeks. After examining me and reviewing the monitor strips, she sat down beside my bed with the serious expression I'd learned to dread. "Tessa, you're not in active labor, but you're showing signs of significant uterine irritability," she said. "Your cervix is beginning to thin, which is concerning at 24 weeks. We need to stop this process before it progresses to actual preterm labor." She prescribed medication to reduce the uterine contractions and ordered complete bed rest for at least 48 hours. But then she asked the question I'd been avoiding. "What's going on in your life that's causing this level of stress? Because what we're seeing isn't just normal pregnancy challenges. This is your body responding to severe emotional trauma." Lying in that hospital bed, monitors beeping around me, and my baby's future hanging in the balance, I couldn't keep pretending that I was handling everything well. The investigation into Pastor Williams' crimes was consuming my life. My grief over David's death remained unprocessed, and the isolation from my church family had left me without any emotional support system. "I'm dealing with some difficult situations related to my husband's death," I said carefully. "There are financial pressures and some conflicts with our church." Dr. Rodriguez nodded understandingly. "Tessa, I need you to understand something. Stress during pregnancy doesn't just affect you, it affects your baby's development. Chronic stress hormones can impact fetal growth, brain development, and your child's long-term health outcomes. You cannot continue at this pace without risking serious complications." The words hit me like a physical blow. In my determination to seek justice for David and expose Pastor Williams' crimes, I'd been risking our baby's health and future. The child David had been so excited to meet might suffer permanent consequences because I was too stubborn to prioritize my pregnancy over my need for vindication. What do I need to do? I asked. Immediate bed rest, stress reduction, and emotional support, she replied. I'm also going to refer you to a counselor who specializes in grief therapy and pregnancy. You cannot process your husband's death and manage high-stress situations simultaneously without professional help. That night, lying alone in the hospital room, I faced the hardest decision of this entire ordeal. I could continue pursuing justice for David at the risk of losing our baby, or I could step back from the investigation to protect my pregnancy and potentially let Pastor Williams escape accountability for his crimes. The baby's heartbeat on the monitor provided a steady rhythm that gradually calmed my racing thoughts. This little person had been fighting to survive despite my body's stress responses, despite the chaos and grief that had defined their earliest months of existence. They deserved better from me, but they also deserved to know the truth about their father. Around midnight, Margaret appeared in my doorway carrying flowers and wearing an expression of deep concern. Somehow she'd heard about my hospitalization, probably through the church prayer chain that still functioned despite my absence from services. How are you feeling? She asked, settling into the chair beside my bed. Scared, I admitted. The doctor says the stress is affecting the baby. I might have to choose between pursuing the investigation and protecting my pregnancy. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, then spoke with unusual firmness. Tessa, David would never want you to risk your baby's health to clear his name. He loved you both too much for that. But if we stop now, Pastor Williams wins, I said. He gets away with stealing from the church, and everyone continues believing that David was somehow spiritually compromised. We don't have to stop, Margaret said gently. We just have to be smarter about how we proceed. You need to focus on your health and your baby. Let me handle the investigation for now. The offer was tempting, but I couldn't ask Margaret to take those risks alone. It's too dangerous. If Pastor Williams suspects you're working against him, I've been working in that church for 12 years. Margaret interrupted. I know how to be careful, and I know how to gather information without raising suspicions. You've given me everything I need to continue David's work safely. She pulled out a manila folder from her purse. I brought you something that might help you understand how important it is for you to focus on this pregnancy right now. Inside the folder was an ultrasound photo, not mine, but one that looked similar. The image was dated 3 years earlier and labeled with a name I didn't recognize. This belonged to Sarah Chen, a young woman who attended our church briefly, Margaret explained. She was pregnant when her husband started asking questions about discrepancies in the missions fund. Pastor Williams used the same tactics on them that he's using on you: spiritual manipulation, isolation, financial pressure. My heart sank. What happened to her? She lost the baby at 26 weeks due to stress-induced complications, Margaret said quietly. The family left town shortly after, broken and devastated. I never spoke up then because I didn't understand what was really happening. I won't make that mistake again. The ultrasound photo in my hands represented everything I feared most. Baby lost because of Pastor Williams' psychological warfare against families who threatened his criminal enterprise. The image was a stark reminder that my investigation had already cost too much and could cost even more if I wasn't careful. Sarah Chen's baby didn't have to die, Margaret continued. But my silence contributed to her family's destruction. I'm not going to let the same thing happen to you and David's child. She reached over and took my hand. Tessa, you've already done the hardest part. You've gathered the evidence, you've documented the crimes, and you've proven David's integrity. Now let me use my position in the church to bring this to the right people at the right time. How? I asked. Carefully and strategically, she replied. I'm going to approach the families who've left the church over financial concerns. Hendersons, the Thompsons, the others. If we can build a coalition of victims, Pastor Williams won't be able to dismiss us as troublemakers or spiritual rebels. The plan made sense, but it felt like giving up just when we were closest to exposing the truth. What if he realizes what you're doing? Then we'll deal with that when it happens, Margaret said. But right now, Your baby needs you to step back from the stress and focus on staying healthy. David's child deserves to be born safely, and David's investigation deserves to be completed properly, not rushed, because we're afraid of losing momentum. A nurse came in to check my vitals and adjust the monitors. My blood pressure had dropped slightly, and the uterine contractions were less frequent than they'd been earlier. The medication and rest were helping, but Dr. Rodriguez had been clear that continued stress could undo any progress. "I have one more thing to show you," Margaret said after the nurse left. She pulled out her phone and showed me a photo of a handwritten note. The note was simple: 20 weeks along today. Heard the heartbeat again, so strong and steady. Can't wait to meet our little fighter. Love, David. I found this in his desk at the church, Margaret explained. He'd written it the week before he died, probably planning to give it to you, with flowers or something special. He was so excited about this baby, Tessa, more excited than I'd ever seen him about anything. The note broke something open in my chest that I'd been holding closed since David's death. Reading his words about our baby, seeing his excitement and love captured in his careful handwriting, reminded me of what was truly at stake in this situation. David had been fighting for justice, but he'd also been fighting for our future, for the family we were building together, for the child who would carry his love forward into the world. Risking that child's health to pursue his investigation would betray everything he'd valued most. "You're right," I said, tears streaming down my face. "David would want me to protect the baby first. But I need your promise that you won't give up on exposing Pastor Williams. You have my word," Margaret said firmly. "I'm going to finish what David started, but I'm going to do it in a way that keeps everyone safe, including you and this baby." That night, I made a decision that felt like both surrender and strength. I was going to step back from actively pursuing the investigation and focus on bringing David's child safely into the world. But I wasn't giving up on justice. I was entrusting it to someone who understood the stakes and had the skills to pursue it carefully. The ultrasound photo of Sarah, Chen's lost baby, stayed with me as a reminder of what Pastor Williams' psychological warfare could cost. But David's note about our baby's strong heartbeat reminded me of what I was fighting to protect, that my child would be born healthy and safe, and they would grow up knowing that their father had been a hero who died defending truth and justice. Pastor Williams would face consequences for his crimes, but not at the expense of the innocent life David had been so excited to meet. Sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is know when to step back and let others carry the fight forward. This was one of those times. While I focused on bed rest and pregnancy health, Pastor Williams apparently decided that my hospitalization was the perfect opportunity to escalate his campaign against me. 3 days after I was discharged, he showed up at my front door unannounced, carrying his worn leather Bible and wearing the concerned expression he used for pastoral visits. I was following doctor's orders, resting on the couch with my feet elevated when his knock interrupted my afternoon quiet time. Through the window, I could see him standing on my porch with that familiar posture of spiritual authority, shoulders back, head tilted slightly as if listening for divine guidance. "Tessa, I heard about your trip to the hospital," he said when I opened the door. "I came to check on you and offer pastoral support during this difficult time." The audacity was breathtaking. This man who had accused me of bringing God's judgment on my family, who had convinced the church to withdraw financial support, who was stealing money that could have helped with my medical bills, was now pretending to care about my well-being. "That's kind of you, Pastor Williams, but I'm following doctor's orders to rest and avoid stress," I replied, not inviting him inside. Of course," he said, but made no move to leave. "Actually, I was hoping we could have a brief conversation about some concerns that have come to my attention. May I come in for just a few minutes?" Every instinct told me to refuse, but I was curious about what had prompted this visit. Was he suspicious about my investigation? Had Margaret's careful inquiries raised red flags? I stepped aside to let him enter, but remained standing near the door. He settled into David's favorite chair without being invited and opened his Bible to a marked passage. Tessa, I've been praying about your spiritual condition, and I'm concerned that your recent troubles might be connected to some rebellious attitudes you've been harboring. What kind of rebellious attitudes? I asked, though I suspected where this was heading. I've heard that you've been asking questions about church finances, he said, his tone shifting from pastoral to accusatory. Speaking with church members about matters that are really none of your concern. This kind of behavior suggests a spirit of distrust and rebellion that could be very dangerous for your spiritual health. So he did know something. Either Margaret had been less careful than we'd hoped, or someone else had reported my activities to him. I felt a chill of fear, not just for myself but for Margaret and anyone else who might be helping with the investigation. I haven't been asking questions about church finances, I said carefully, which was technically true. I'd been reviewing David's research, not conducting new inquiries. Tessa, please don't compound your spiritual problems by lying to me, Pastor Williams said, his voice taking on the stern tone he used for disciplinary conversations. I know you've been meeting with Margaret, that you've been discussing private church business, that you've been spreading concerns about financial matters you don't understand. The specificity of his knowledge was alarming. Someone had been watching us, reporting our activities. Margaret might be in more danger than we'd realized. Margaret is a friend who's been checking on me during my pregnancy complications, I said. I'm sorry if that's caused any confusion. Pastor Williams leaned forward in David's chair, and I had the strange sensation that he was deliberately claiming space that belonged to my deceased husband. Tessa, I'm going to be very direct with you. Your husband's death was a tragedy, but it's also an opportunity for spiritual growth if you respond correctly to God's discipline. God's discipline, I repeated, feeling my blood pressure rise. David was a good man, but he was struggling with pride in his final months, Pastor Williams said with practiced compassion. He was questioning pastoral authority, making accusations about church finances, creating division in the body of Christ. The Lord removed him before his spiritual condition could deteriorate further. The psychological manipulation was stunning in its cruelty. Pastor Williams was rewriting David's moral courage as spiritual failure, turning his investigation into church corruption, into evidence of pride and rebellion. He was using my husband's death to silence questions about his own criminal behavior. If you continue down this same path of questioning and suspicion, he continued, you're going to bring further judgment on yourself and your unborn child. Is that really what you want? The threat was barely veiled. He was suggesting that my baby's health problems were connected to my supposed spiritual rebellion, that continued questioning could result in more serious consequences. It was spiritual terrorism designed to terrify me into silence. Pastor Williams, I think you should leave, I said, moving toward the door. Tessa, I'm trying to help you, he replied, but didn't move from David's chair. But my patience isn't unlimited. The church board is already concerned about your attitude and your influence on other members. If you continue to spread discord and suspicion, we may have to take more formal disciplinary action. What kind of disciplinary action? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Church discipline is a biblical process for addressing unrepentant sin, he said, pulling out a business card and placing it on my coffee table. We would prefer not to go that route, but persistent rebellion sometimes requires more serious intervention. I looked at the business card he'd left. It belonged to a lawyer named Robert Kemp, with a note written on the back, specializes in defamation and harassment cases. The message was crystal clear. If I continued investigating his crimes or speaking with other church members, Pastor Williams would use legal intimidation to silence me. He was threatening to sue me for defamation while he was the one committing fraud. I found this attorney very helpful when dealing with James Cooper's false accusations a few years ago, Pastor Williams said casually. Some people think they can spread lies about pastoral leadership without consequences. They're usually surprised to learn how seriously the law takes defamation of religious leaders. After he left, I sat in my living room holding the lawyer's business card, and trying to process what had just happened. Pastor Williams hadn't just threatened me, he'd essentially confessed to using legal intimidation against previous church members who'd questioned his behavior. James Cooper, the man Margaret had mentioned as leaving under suspicious circumstances, had apparently been silenced through threatened litigation. The pattern was becoming clear. Pastor Williams didn't just steal money, he systematically destroyed anyone who discovered his crimes through a combination of spiritual manipulation, social isolation, and legal threats. He'd turned the church into his personal criminal enterprise and used every tool at his disposal to protect it. But he'd made a critical error in threatening me directly. By coming to my house and explicitly connecting my spiritual condition to my baby's health, by threatening church discipline and legal action, he'd provided evidence of his manipulative tactics that could be useful in exposing his crimes. I called Margaret immediately and told her about Pastor Williams' visit. She was quiet for a long moment, then spoke with grim determination. "He's scared," she said. "That visit wasn't pastoral care, it was damage control. He knows we're on to him, and he's trying to intimidate you into backing down." "Are you in danger?" I asked. "He seemed to know about our meetings." "Probably," Margaret admitted. "But it's too late to worry about that now. His threat to pursue church discipline against you tells me he's planning to move against both of us soon. We need to accelerate our timeline." She was right. Pastor Williams' counter-attack meant we were running out of time to expose his crimes before he could destroy evidence or eliminate threats. The investigation had moved from a careful pursuit of justice to a race against a dangerous man who was willing to use any means necessary to protect his secrets. The lawyer's business card sat on my coffee table like a declaration of war. Pastor Williams had escalated the conflict, thinking he could intimidate a grieving pregnant widow into silence. He was about to learn that threatening David's family had been a serious mistake. Margaret's acceleration of our timeline meant taking the investigation public sooner than we'd planned. But Pastor Williams' direct threats had eliminated the luxury of careful, gradual exposure. If we were going to bring him down, we needed to do it before he could destroy evidence or eliminate more witnesses. Margaret's first move was brilliant in its simplicity. She contacted Tessa Martin, the investigative reporter for the Davao Daily Herald, our local newspaper. Sarah had a reputation for thorough research and fearless reporting on local corruption. More importantly, she attended a different church across town and had no personal loyalty to Pastor Williams. "I told her we had documentation of financial fraud at a local church," Margaret explained during our phone conversation. "She's interested, but she wants to see solid evidence before she consider running a story." The meeting was arranged for the following afternoon at Sarah's office. Margaret would present David's financial evidence while I provided context about the personal cost of Pastor Williams' crimes. We'd decided that my pregnancy would actually be an asset in the interview. It would be harder for Pastor Williams to dismiss a grieving widow as a disgruntled troublemaker. Tessa Martin was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 30s, with sharp eyes and the kind of focused attention that made me understand why sources trusted her with sensitive information. Her office was cluttered with files, newspaper clippings, and multiple computer monitors displaying what appeared to be ongoing investigations. "Tell me about your husband," she said, after we'd settled into chairs across from her desk. "Start from the beginning." I explained David's role as church treasurer, his discovery of financial irregularities, and his systematic investigation into Pastor Williams' embezzlement. Sarah took detailed notes and asked pointed questions about dates, amounts, and documentation methods. When Margaret produced copies of the financial records, Sarah's demeanor shifted from interested to intense. She spent over an hour reviewing bank statements, fake invoices, and the evidence of shell companies Pastor Williams had used to launder stolen money. "This is substantial," she said finally. "We're talking about potential criminal charges, embezzlement, fraud, money laundering. Have you taken this to law enforcement?" "Not yet," Margaret admitted. "We wanted to be certain we had enough evidence to make charges stick." Pastor Williams has been very careful to cover his tracks and discredit anyone who questions him. Sarah nodded understandingly. That's actually smart. Prosecutors won't move on cases like this unless they're confident of conviction. Religious leader fraud cases are particularly sensitive because juries sometimes have trouble believing that pastors could commit serious crimes. She asked about the pattern of families leaving the church under suspicious circumstances, and Margaret provided names and contact information for people who might be willing to speak with a reporter. Sarah's expression grew more serious as she realized the scope of Pastor Williams' psychological manipulation. "What's your goal here?" Sarah asked. "Do you want justice, or do you want revenge?" "Justice," I said immediately. "I want the truth about my husband's character to be known, and I want Pastor Williams held accountable for his crimes. But mostly, I want to protect other families from going through what we've experienced." Sarah studied me for a moment, then made a decision. "I'm going to investigate this story, but I need you to understand what you're getting into. Once this becomes public, Pastor Williams will likely retaliate against both of you. He'll try to discredit your evidence and destroy your reputations. Are you prepared for that?" Margaret and I exchanged glances. We'd already experienced Pastor Williams' retaliation tactics, and we knew they would only intensify once our investigation became public knowledge. "We're prepared," Margaret said. "You've already lost our church community and faced his threats. The question is whether we can expose him before he destroys more lives." Sarah spent the next week conducting independent research that validated our evidence. She contacted the contractors whose names appeared on fake invoices, verified that the shell companies were registered to post office boxes, and traced financial transactions through public records. Her breakthrough came when she discovered a newspaper article from Pastor Williams' previous church in another state. 5 years earlier, he'd left that congregation to pursue new ministry opportunities, just months after questions had been raised about missing funds from their capital campaign. "He's done this before," Sarah told us during our follow-up meeting. "I found similar patterns at 2 other churches where he served. He comes in, builds trust, starts major fundraising campaigns, then systematically steals while using spiritual manipulation to silence critics." The revelation that Pastor Williams was a career criminal who had victimized multiple congregations transformed our local story into something much larger. This wasn't just about one corrupt pastor, it was about a predator who used religious authority to exploit faithful people across multiple communities. Sarah's article appeared on the front page of the Davao Daily Herald on a Thursday morning under the headline, "Local Pastor Accused of Embezzling Building Fund." The story included photographs of David and Pastor Williams, excerpts from financial documents, and quotes from Margaret about the church's failure to provide adequate oversight. The community response was immediate and overwhelming. The newspapers, phone lines were flooded with calls from current and former church members, other religious leaders, and law enforcement officials. By noon, the story had been picked up by regional news outlets and was spreading across social media. Most importantly, other victims began coming forward. The Henderson family called Sarah that afternoon to confirm they'd left the church over financial concerns. James Cooper, the man who'd been threatened with legal action years earlier, contacted the newspaper to share his story about Pastor Williams' intimidation tactics. But perhaps the most significant response came from an unexpected source. Sarah Chen, the young woman whose pregnancy complications had resulted in losing her baby 3 years earlier. She called me directly after seeing the article. "I read your story in the newspaper," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "Pastor Williams destroyed my family, and I've been too ashamed to tell anyone what really happened. But seeing your courage in speaking out, I want to help expose him." Sarah Chen's testimony added a crucial element to our case. She could document the pattern of Pastor Williams using spiritual manipulation to silence families who discovered his crimes. Her lost baby became a symbol of the human cost of his psychological terrorism. Within 48 hours of the article's publication, The state attorney general's office announced they were opening a formal investigation into financial crimes at the church. The Federal Bureau of Investigation indicated they might also become involved due to the interstate nature of Pastor Williams' alleged crimes. Pastor Williams' response was predictable but devastating. He held an emergency congregational meeting to declare that he was the victim of a campaign of persecution by disgruntled former members. He painted Margaret and me as bitter women who were trying to destroy the church because we couldn't accept God's discipline in our lives. I'm disappointed, but not surprised that some people have chosen to spread lies rather than accept spiritual correction, he announced from the pulpit. David Martin was struggling with pride and rebellion in his final months, and his widow is continuing down that same destructive path. But his attempt to control the narrative was undermined by the growing number of victims coming forward, and the documented evidence that couldn't be explained away. The local community was beginning to understand that they'd been manipulated by a skilled predator who had used their faith against them. The newspaper clipping from Sarah's article became a symbol of hope for everyone. Pastor Williams had victimized. For the first time, his crimes were being exposed to public scrutiny, and his victims were finding their voices. The community was finally awakening to the truth about the man they'd trusted with their spiritual lives and their financial resources. And that awakening was about to bring consequences Pastor Williams had never imagined possible. The church board called an emergency meeting 3 days after Sarah Martinez's article hit the front page. Margaret received notification that all board members, church staff, and concerned parties were invited to attend what was being billed as a forum for addressing recent allegations and restoring unity to our church family. I knew this was Pastor Williams' attempt to regain control of the narrative, but Margaret convinced me that attending the meeting was crucial for our case. If we don't show up, he'll claim we're afraid to face the congregation with our accusations. She argued, "This is our chance to present the evidence publicly and let people see his response." The meeting was scheduled for Sunday evening in the church sanctuary, the same room where David and I had been married, where I'd last heard Pastor Williams preach about God's discipline, where my husband had served faithfully as treasurer while unknowingly documenting crimes. Margaret and I arrived 30 minutes early to find the parking lot already crowded. Word of the meeting had spread beyond the formal notification, and it seemed like half the town was planning to attend. I recognized cars belonging to former church members who'd left under suspicious circumstances, reporters from regional news outlets, and even some law enforcement vehicles. Inside, the sanctuary buzzed with tense conversation. Current church members clustered in their usual pews, looking bewildered and defensive. Former members sat separately, many of them people I hadn't seen since David's funeral. Margaret and I chose seats near the back, close enough to participate, but positioned for a quick exit if the meeting became hostile. Pastor Williams entered through the side door at exactly 7 o'clock, carrying his leather Bible and wearing his navy suit, the same outfit he'd worn when threatening me at my home. He was accompanied by the 5 church board members, all of whom looked uncomfortable with the situation they were facing. Board chairman Robert Stevens called the meeting to order and read a prepared statement about the church's commitment to transparency and accountability. But it was clear that Pastor Williams was in control of the proceedings. "My friends," Pastor Williams began, his voice carrying the familiar tone of pastoral authority, "we're gathered tonight because our church family is under attack. False accusations have been made against me and against this ministry by people who are struggling with spiritual rebellion and personal bitterness." He opened his Bible to a marked passage and read about false witnesses and those who seek to destroy God's servants. The manipulation was textbook. He was framing the evening as a spiritual battle between faithful believers and rebellious accusers. "Want to address these accusations directly," he continued, "because you deserve to hear the truth from your pastor, rather than believe lies spread by those who have turned away from God's authority." He spent 20 minutes presenting his version of events. David had been struggling with pride and financial confusion in his final months. Margaret was a disgruntled employee angry about being corrected for overstepping her role, and I was a grieving widow who couldn't accept God's will in my husband's death. The so-called evidence being presented in the newspaper consists of documents taken from church files without authorization. Pastor Williams declared, financial records that have been misinterpreted by people who don't understand church accounting procedures. The audience was clearly divided. Current church members nodded along with Pastor Williams' explanations, while former members and community observers appeared increasingly skeptical of his defensive posture. When he opened the floor for questions, Margaret stood up first. Pastor Williams, she said, her voice steady despite the hostile stares from current church members, can you explain why the building fund account shows donations totaling $89,000, while bank records show only $52,000 actually deposited? Margaret, as I've explained to you before, building fund management involves multiple accounts and complex transactions, he replied dismissively. Your role as secretary doesn't require you to understand these financial details. Then perhaps you can explain why Maya Construction, which appears on several invoices for work never performed, is registered to a post office box that you rent under an assumed name. The sanctuary fell silent. Pastor Williams' face flushed, and for the first time that evening, he appeared rattled by a question he hadn't anticipated. I don't know what you're talking about, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Margaret pulled out copies of the fake invoices and held them up for everyone to see. These are invoices for $15,000 worth of foundation work that was never done. The checks were written to a company that doesn't exist, registered to an address you control. Before Pastor Williams could respond, James Cooper stood up from the middle of the sanctuary. Pastor Williams, 3 years ago you threatened to sue me for defamation when I asked questions about the missions fund. Do you still have that lawyer's business card you showed me? More hands went up around the sanctuary. Sarah Chen stood and identified herself, then spoke about losing her baby after Pastor Williams' psychological manipulation during her husband's investigation into financial irregularities. You told us our baby died because my husband was rebellious against pastoral authority, she said, her voice breaking. You used our grief to cover up your crimes. The momentum had shifted. Pastor Williams was no longer controlling the narrative. He was being confronted by multiple victims who could document his pattern of financial crime and psychological abuse. These people are clearly coordinating their attacks against me, Pastor Williams said, trying to regain control. This is exactly the kind of persecution that Jesus warned his followers to expect. But then Robert Stevens, the board chairman, asked the question that changed everything. Pastor Williams, would you be willing to submit to an independent financial audit to clear up these accusations? The request was reasonable and would have been easy to agree to if Pastor Williams were innocent. His refusal to answer immediately told everyone in the sanctuary that he had something to hide. Robert, I'm disappointed that you would give credibility to these false accusations, Pastor Williams said. An audit would be a waste of church resources and a capitulation to the enemies of this ministry. It would also definitively prove your innocence, Stevens replied. If these accusations are false, an audit would vindicate you completely. The meeting continued for another hour, but Pastor Williams never recovered from his inability to agree to financial transparency. More victims shared their stories, more evidence was presented, and the pastor's denials became increasingly desperate and unconvincing. The meeting ended without resolution, but the damage to Pastor Williams' credibility was irreversible. Board members who had entered the evening supporting their pastor left, with serious questions about his honesty and competence. Margaret and I walked to our cars through a crowd of people, offering support and sharing their own experiences with Pastor Williams' manipulation. For the first time since David's death, I felt like we were part of a community again, not the artificial church family that had abandoned us, but a real community of people committed to truth and justice. The official church board meeting minutes, which Margaret would prepare as secretary, would document everything that had been said that evening, including Pastor Williams' refusal to submit to financial accountability and his inability to explain obvious evidence of fraud. Those minutes would become crucial evidence in the criminal case that was already building against him. Pastor Williams had walked into that meeting expecting to silence his accusers, but instead he had provided prosecutors with documented evidence of his guilt and his consciousness of guilt. The confrontation was over, but the reckoning was just beginning 2 weeks after the explosive church board meeting. As criminal investigations intensified and Pastor Williams' denials became increasingly desperate, I went into labor at 36 weeks. The timing was earlier than expected, but not dangerously premature. My body had apparently decided that bringing new life into the world was more important than waiting for the legal system to finish dealing with old corruption. The contractions started at 3 a.m, pulling me from restless sleep with an intensity that left no doubt about what was happening. David should have been there to drive me to the hospital, to hold my hand and remind me to breathe, to welcome our daughter into the world with tears of joy and promises of protection. Instead, I drove myself to the hospital while calling Margaret, who had become my emergency contact and closest friend through this ordeal. She met me at the maternity ward entrance, breathless from rushing across town in her pajamas and robe. "How are you feeling?" she asked as a nurse helped me into a wheelchair. "Terrified and excited and incredibly sad," I admitted, because Margaret was the one person who understood that this moment was simultaneously joyful and heartbreaking. Dr. Rodriguez was already at the hospital for another delivery, and her familiar presence provided comfort during the scariest and most wonderful experience of my life. As my labor progressed, she monitored both my health and the baby's, assuring me that despite the stress of recent months, everything was proceeding normally. "Your baby is strong," she said during one of her checks. "All that fighting spirit you've shown over the past several months, your daughter inherited it." Between contractions, I thought about David's excitement about becoming a father, his careful planning for our child's future, his determination to create a better world for the next generation. He died fighting corruption because he wanted our daughter to grow up in a community built on truth rather than lies. Margaret stayed with me throughout the labor, holding my hand during contractions and updating me on developments in the criminal case against Pastor Williams. The timing was almost surreal while I was bringing David's child into the world. Prosecutors were finalizing charges against the man who had stolen from our church and manipulated our grief. "The FBI arrested him this morning," Margaret told me during a brief break between contractions. "Charges include embezzlement, fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. He's being held without bail." The news that Pastor Williams was finally facing justice provided an unexpected surge of strength during the most difficult part of labor. Our daughter would be born into a world where truth had triumphed over lies, where victims had found their voices, where criminals faced consequences for their actions. Hope David Martin was born at 2:47 p.m. on a sunny Tuesday afternoon, weighing 6 pounds and 3 ounces. She was perfect 10 fingers, 10 toes, David's dark hair, and the strongest pair of lungs I'd ever heard. When Dr. Rodriguez placed her on my chest, I felt David's presence so strongly that I looked around the room expecting to see him. "She's beautiful," Margaret whispered, tears streaming down her face. David would be so proud. I named her Hope because that's what she represented, hope for the future. Hope that good people like David hadn't died in vain. Hope that truth and justice could prevail even in the darkest circumstances. Her middle name honored David's memory and ensured that she would always carry part of her with her. The hospital room filled with flowers and visitors over the next 2 days. But these weren't the superficial well-wishers who had surrounded me after David's death. These were genuine friends who had stood with me during the fight for justice. Sarah Chun, the Henderson family, James Cooper, and others who had found the courage to speak truth about Pastor Williams' crimes. Sarah Martinez, the reporter whose investigation had helped expose Pastor Williams, came to meet Hope and interview me about the connection between personal tragedy and public justice. Her article about Hope's birth would run alongside coverage of Pastor Williams' arrest, creating a powerful narrative about how new life and truth can emerge from loss and corruption. How does it feel to hold your daughter while knowing her father's investigation led to criminal charges? Sarah asked gently. It feels like David's work is finally complete, I said, looking down at Hope's sleeping face. He died trying to protect people from a predator, and now that predator can't hurt anyone else. Our daughter will grow up knowing that her father was a hero who stood for truth even when it cost him everything. During Hope's second night in the hospital, Margaret brought unexpected visitors, 2 FBI agents who wanted to interview me about David's investigation and Pastor Williams' threats against our family. They were respectful of the timing, keeping their questions brief and focused on documentation rather than emotional trauma. Your husband's financial records were crucial to building our case, Agent Patterson explained. His meticulous documentation and the audio recordings he made provided evidence we could never have obtained otherwise. Will Pastor Williams be convicted? I asked. The evidence is overwhelming, Agent Martinez replied. He's already indicated through his attorney that he's willing to discuss plea agreements. Your husband built an airtight case against him. They also informed me that Pastor Williams had been using similar schemes at churches in 3 other states over the past 15 years. David's investigation had not only exposed local crimes, but had opened a broader federal case that could protect future congregations from similar victimization. Hope's hospital bracelet became a symbol of new beginnings emerging from old sorrows. This tiny piece of plastic represented everything David had fought for: a future built on truth, a community committed to protecting the vulnerable, a world where criminals couldn't hide behind religious authority. As I prepared to take Hope home, I realized that David's death had not been meaningless tragedy, but had been transformed into meaningful sacrifice. Our daughter would grow up knowing that her father had died, defending what was right, that his courage had protected other families from experiencing our pain. The criminal case against Pastor Williams would continue for months, but the most important victory had already been won. Truth had conquered lies, justice had prevailed over corruption, and new life had emerged from the ashes of loss. Hope David Martin was born into a world that was better because her father had lived in it, and safer because he had been willing to die defending it. She would carry his legacy of integrity, courage, and commitment to truth into a future he would never see, but had helped create. Labor had brought more than just a baby. It had brought the completion of David's work and the beginning of Hope's story. 6 weeks after Hope's birth, Pastor Williams was formally charged with 17 federal crimes, including embezzlement, wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to defraud religious organizations. The indictment detailed a 15-year pattern of criminal behavior across 4 states, an estimated total theft exceeding $400,000 from various church communities. I was home with Hope, still adjusting to the overwhelming responsibility of single motherhood, when Margaret called with news that the FBI had arrested Pastor Williams at his home that morning. Federal agents had also executed search warrants on the church building, his residence, and several bank accounts, seizing evidence that would support additional charges. They found everything, Margaret said, her voice filled with satisfaction and relief. Financial records, fake invoices, correspondence with accomplices, even evidence of threats against church members who questioned him. David's investigation was just the beginning. Pastor Williams has been running criminal operations for over a decade. The arrest made national news because of the scope of the crimes and the number of victims involved. Pastor Williams had perfected a system of gaining trust in religious communities, launching major fundraising campaigns, then systematically stealing while using spiritual manipulation to silence anyone who discovered his crimes. The FBI's investigation revealed that David hadn't been his first victim. In Pennsylvania, a church treasurer named Michael Santos had died in a suspicious car accident just days before he was scheduled to meet with bank investigators about missing funds. In Ohio, a congregant who questioned building fund irregularities had been driven from his church through character assassination and legal threats, before dying of a stress-induced heart attack. Pastor Williams didn't just steal money, Agent Patterson explained during a victim impact interview. He stole lives, families, faith, and hope. The psychological warfare he used against people who discovered his crimes caused trauma that lasted years after his theft was complete. The criminal case moved forward with unprecedented speed because of the overwhelming evidence David had compiled and the cooperation of victims across multiple states. Pastor Williams' attorney quickly indicated that his client was interested in plea negotiations rather than facing trial on charges that could result in decades in federal prison. But before any plea could be finalized, the community demanded accountability through other channels. The church board, now led by Robert Stevens after Pastor Williams' resignation, voted unanimously to pursue civil recovery of stolen funds and to implement comprehensive financial oversight policies that would prevent future abuse. We failed our congregation by trusting too completely and questioning too little, Stevens said during a congregational meeting. David Martin died trying to protect us from our own naivety. The least we can do is honor his sacrifice by ensuring this never happens again. The civil lawsuit against Pastor Williams resulted in the seizure of his home, vehicles, and personal assets to compensate victims. The church recovered approximately $180,000 of the stolen building fund money, enough to resume the construction project that had been abandoned when the theft was discovered. More importantly, the church implemented the transparency policies David had advocated during his final months as treasurer. All financial records became available for member review. Multiple people were required to approve large expenditures, and regular independent audits were mandated to prevent future embezzlement. Margaret was elected as the new church treasurer, with a mandate to rebuild the financial systems David had tried to protect. Every policy we implement, every safeguard we create, honors David's memory and protects future congregations from predators like Pastor Williams, she said during her acceptance speech. The psychological impact on the community was as significant as the financial recovery. Families who had been driven away by Pastor Williams' manipulation began returning to church as word spread about the leadership changes and commitment to accountability. The congregation that had been fractured by lies and intimidation slowly began healing through truth and transparency. But perhaps the most meaningful consequence was the establishment of the David Martin Memorial Fund for Church Financial Integrity. The fund provides grants to small congregations for independent financial audits and training programs that help church members recognize signs of clerical abuse. David believed that faithful stewardship required vigilance and accountability. I said during the fund's inaugural ceremony, this memorial ensures that his commitment to protecting religious communities from financial predators will continue long after his death. Pastor Williams ultimately pleaded guilty to all charges in exchange for a sentence of 12 years in federal prison and restitution payments to victims across 4 states. During his sentencing hearing, he offered what appeared to be genuine remorse for his crimes and their impact on the families he had victimized. I used people's faith against them, he said in his statement to the court. I manipulated their trust and turned their grief into guilt. I am responsible for destroying families, ending lives, and corrupting institutions that should have been safe havens for people seeking God. The judge's response was blunt. Mr. Williams, you didn't just steal money, you stole hope, faith, and lives. David Martin died trying to stop your crimes, and other victims suffered trauma that will last the rest of their lives. Your sentence reflects not just the financial damage you caused, but the spiritual and emotional devastation you inflicted on vulnerable people. The police report documenting Pastor Williams' confession and sentencing became a powerful symbol of justice finally served. Reading his admission of guilt, his acknowledgement that he had used spiritual authority to commit crimes and cover them up, provided closure that I hadn't expected to feel. 3 months after his sentencing, I received an unexpected letter from Pastor Williams in prison. In it, he specifically apologized for his treatment of me after David's death, acknowledging that he had used my grief to deflect attention from his crimes. I told you that God was punishing you for hidden sins, he wrote. The truth is that I was the one living in sin, and I used your tragedy to hide my own guilt. David was a good man who died trying to protect people from me. You deserved support and comfort in your loss, not manipulation and blame. The letter didn't change what had happened, but it provided official acknowledgement that David had been right, that his investigation had been justified, and that the accusations against my spiritual condition had been lies designed to protect a criminal. I shared the letter with Margaret, Sarah Chun, and the other victims who had found the courage to speak out against Pastor Williams. For all of us, his written admission of guilt represented validation that our painful journey toward truth had been worth the cost. The church that had once blamed me for bringing God's judgment on my family now honors David's memory with a memorial plaque in the sanctuary. The inscription read, David Martin, church treasurer and defender of truth. His courage in exposing corruption cost him his life but saved his community. Standing in that sanctuary with hope in my arms, looking at the memorial that acknowledged David as a hero rather than a spiritual failure, I finally felt peace about his death. He hadn't died because of hidden sins or divine punishment. He died because he was willing to stand against evil even when it wore the mask of religious authority. The reckoning was complete. Justice had been served, truth had prevailed, and the community David had died trying to protect was finally safe from the predator who had exploited their faith. Pastor Williams would spend the next 12 years in federal prison, unable to victimize other congregations or manipulate other grieving families. But perhaps the most important victory was that Hope would grow up knowing the truth about her. Father, that David Martin had been a man of integrity who sacrificed his life to protect others from corruption and abuse. She would carry his legacy of courage and commitment to truth into a future he had helped make possible. 1 year after Pastor Williams' sentencing, the church dedicated its rebuilt sanctuary with a cornerstone ceremony that honored both healing and accountability. The new stone inscription read, "Rebuilt on truth, transparency, and David's memory, a community committed to protecting the vulnerable." Hope was walking by then, taking unsteady steps around the church fellowship hall, while former enemies became friends united by shared commitment to preventing future abuse. The child who had been born during the fight for justice was now the symbol of new beginnings built on painful but necessary truth. The church's transformation had been remarkable. Under new leadership committed to transparency, the congregation had grown from the fractured, suspicious community Pastor Williams had left behind to a thriving fellowship that attracted families seeking authentic spiritual experience without manipulation or hidden agendas. Margaret, now serving her second term as treasurer, had implemented financial oversight systems that exceeded industry standards. Every transaction was documented. Every expense was approved by multiple people, and quarterly reports were distributed to all members with detailed explanations of how their donations were being used. We learned that trust without verification isn't faith, it's naivety, she said during the cornerstone ceremony. David died trying to teach us that godly stewardship requires vigilance and accountability. We honor his memory by ensuring that no future predator can exploit our congregation. The healing process had been more complex than simply changing policies and leadership. Many church members had experienced genuine trauma from learning that their trusted spiritual leader had been manipulating them for years. The realization that their faith had been exploited for criminal purposes required therapeutic processing that extended far beyond Sunday services. I had started attending counseling with Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a grief specialist who helped me work through the complex emotions of losing David while simultaneously fighting to clear his name. The sessions were difficult but necessary for my own healing and for Hope's healthy development. "You survived spiritual abuse while pregnant and dealing with grief," Dr. Rodriguez pointed out during one session. "The strength that required is extraordinary, but you also need to process the trauma of having your reality questioned and your grief manipulated." The counseling helped me understand that Pastor Williams' psychological manipulation had been a form of abuse that left lasting scars on everyone he targeted. Recognizing this helped me forgive myself for the moments when I doubted David's integrity or questioned my own perceptions of events. Other victims had also sought professional help to process their experiences. Sarah Chum, whose pregnancy loss had been weaponized by Pastor Williams to silence her family's questions, worked with a therapist specializing in reproductive trauma and spiritual abuse. James Cooper attended group therapy with other men who had been intimidated by religious leaders. Pastor Williams didn't just steal money, Sarah Chun said during a victim impact support group meeting. He stole our ability to trust our own judgment, our confidence in questioning authority, our sense of safety in religious spaces. Healing from that requires more than justice. It requires rebuilding our internal sense of truth and worth. The support group, which met monthly at the community center, had become a model for other communities dealing with clerical abuse. Victims shared strategies for recognizing manipulation, rebuilding trust, and creating accountability systems that protected vulnerable people without destroying faith communities. My own healing accelerated when I began dating Michael Thompson, a seminary student studying pastoral ethics and accountability. We met at a conference about preventing clergy abuse, where I was speaking about David's investigation, and he was researching best practices for financial transparency in religious organizations. Michael understood the complex relationship between faith and trauma that defined my experience. He honored David's memory while building a relationship with a hope in me that was based on mutual respect and shared commitment to truth and justice. David will always be Hope's father and your first love, Michael said during one of our early conversations. I'm not trying to replace him. I'm trying to honor his legacy by supporting the family he loved and the causes he died defending. Our relationship developed slowly, built on friendship and shared values rather than romantic urgency. Michael's theological training included extensive education about spiritual abuse and the warning signs of manipulative religious leadership. He understood that Hope and I needed partners who would never use faith as a weapon or authority as a shield for harmful behavior. The church community embraced our relationship because they recognized Michael's genuine character and his commitment to the transparency principles David had advocated. When he proposed to me in the church sanctuary, beneath the memorial plaque honoring David's courage, even longtime church members who had initially blamed me for bringing God's judgment on the congregation offered their congratulations and support. Hope, now walking steadily and beginning to speak her first words, called Michael Mimi and David Daddy from the photographs and stories I shared with her daily. She would grow up knowing that she had two men who loved her, one who had died protecting her community, and one who was committed to continuing that protection. The cornerstone ceremony concluded with a commitment ritual where every church member signed a covenant promising to support accountability, transparency, and protection of vulnerable people. Children, including Hope, placed their handprints in clay tiles that would be incorporated into the new sanctuary walls. These handprints represent the future we're building, Margaret said, as Hope pressed her tiny hand into the soft clay. A future where children will be safe from predators who exploit faith for personal gain, where families will be supported rather than manipulated, where truth will be valued over comfort. As I watched Hope's handprint being preserved in the clay, I realized that David's death had indeed been transformed into something meaningful. The community he'd died trying to protect was now actively committed to protecting others. The church that had blamed me for his death was now honoring his sacrifice. The predator who had used our grief to cover his crimes was now in prison, unable to victimize other families. Healing hadn't erased the pain of losing David, but it had given that pain purpose and meaning. Our daughter would grow up in a world that was safer, because her father had been willing to fight for truth, and because her community had learned from his sacrifice. 2 years after Pastor Williams' conviction, I received an acceptance letter that would change the trajectory of my life and Hope's future. After months of applications, interviews, and careful consideration, I had been accepted into the Masters of Divinity program at the regional seminary. With a specialization in pastoral care and church ethics, the decision to pursue ministry hadn't come easily. The trauma of spiritual abuse had left me questioning whether religious institutions could ever be truly safe for vulnerable people. But my experience fighting Pastor Williams had also shown me the crucial need for ethical leaders who understood the warning signs of clerical abuse and were committed to preventing it. "David would be so proud of you," Margaret said when I showed her the acceptance letter. "He always said you had the heart of a pastor. You care more about protecting people than maintaining comfortable lives." The seminary program was designed for working adults, with evening and weekend classes that allowed me to continue my job at the bank while pursuing my calling to ministry. Michael, who was completing his own divinity degree, provided invaluable support with Hope's care, and my academic workload. My first semester focused on biblical foundations and church history, but I was most drawn to courses on pastoral ethics and crisis intervention. I wanted to understand how religious authority could be structured to prevent abuse rather than enable it, how communities could maintain accountability without destroying trust. Professor Sarah Williams, no relation to our former pastor despite the shared surname, became my mentor in developing frameworks for ethical leadership. Her own research focused on institutional responses to clergy misconduct, and she was fascinated by my first-hand experience with both clerical abuse and community recovery. "Your husband's investigation represents exactly the kind of lay accountability that healthy churches need," she explained during one of our meetings. "Most clergy abuse continues because ordinary church members feel unqualified to question pastoral authority. David's financial expertise gave him the tools to recognize corruption, but more importantly, he had the moral courage to act on what he discovered." Under Professor Williams' guidance, I began developing what would become my master's thesis, a comprehensive training program for lay leaders to recognize and respond to clerical abuse. The program combined financial oversight education with psychological awareness, training to help church members identify manipulation tactics before they could cause extensive damage. The research required interviewing other victims of clerical abuse, studying case histories from multiple denominations, and analyzing the psychological techniques predators used to maintain control over their victims. It was emotionally challenging work that often triggered memories of my own experience, but it was also empowering to transform trauma into tools for protecting others. Hope, now 2 years old and speaking in full sentences, often accompanied me to seminary classes during childcare emergencies. The other students and professors embraced her presence, and she became the unofficial mascot of our pastoral care cohort. Her innocent questions about why some pastors hurt people led to profound classroom discussions about power, vulnerability, and protection. "Mama, why did the bad pastor make people sad?" she asked one evening while I was studying case files about clerical abuse. "Because he forgot that pastors are supposed to help people, not hurt them," I explained. "That's why Mama is learning to be a good pastor, so I can help protect people from bad pastors." Hope's simple understanding of good versus bad leadership reminded me that ethical ministry wasn't complicated in principle, even if it was difficult in practice. Children instinctively understood that authority should protect rather than exploit, serve rather than control, heal rather than harm. During my second year of seminary, I began doing clinical pastoral education at the regional hospital, providing spiritual care for patients and families in crisis. The work was challenging but rewarding, as I learned to offer comfort without manipulation, support without control, hope without false promises. My experience with grief and spiritual abuse gave me unique insight into the complex emotions people faced during medical crises. I could recognize when patients were being manipulated by well-meaning but misguided religious visitors, and I could provide alternative frameworks for understanding suffering that didn't blame victims for their circumstances. "You have unusual wisdom for someone so young in ministry," my supervising chaplain observed. Most seminarians take years to develop the kind of pastoral intuition you already possess. I knew that my wisdom had been earned through painful experience rather than academic study. Surviving Pastor William's manipulation while protecting my pregnancy and fighting for justice had taught me lessons about human nature and spiritual abuse that couldn't be learned from textbooks. The highlight of my seminary experience came during my third year, when I was invited to speak at the National Conference on Preventing Clergy Abuse. My presentation, titled Financial Transparency as Spiritual Protection, outlined how David's investigation could serve as a model for preventing future clerical crimes. My husband discovered that financial accountability and spiritual accountability are inseparably connected. I told the audience of religious leaders, law enforcement officials, and victim advocates. Pastors who steal money also steal trust, hope, and faith. Communities that fail to monitor their finances also fail to protect their most vulnerable members. The presentation was well received, and I was approached by multiple denominational leaders interested in implementing David's oversight model in their own churches. The work felt like a continuation of David's mission, protecting religious communities from predators who exploited faith for personal gain. Michael and I were married that summer in the same sanctuary where David and I had been wed. But the ceremony was completely different in tone and meaning. Where my first wedding had been about beginning a life together, my second wedding was about blending two lives that had already been shaped by loss, trauma, and commitment to service. Hope served as our flower girl, walking down the aisle in a white dress while carrying a bouquet that included flowers from David's grave. The service included a moment of remembrance for David, acknowledging that our new family was built on the foundation of his sacrifice and the lessons learned from his death. David will always be part of our family, Michael said during his vows. I promise to honor his memory by loving you and Hope, by continuing his work for justice and transparency, and by ensuring that his legacy of courage and integrity lives on in our home. The college acceptance letter that had started this journey sat framed on my desk as a reminder that transformation was possible even after devastating loss. What had begun as a search for justice had evolved into a calling to prevent future victims from experiencing the trauma our family had endured. Seminary graduation was scheduled for the following spring, and I already had job offers from churches seeking pastors with expertise in crisis intervention and abuse prevention. Hope would grow up watching her mother serve congregations, committed to transparency and accountability, the principles her father had died defending. The new beginning wasn't about forgetting the past, but about transforming it into a foundation for protecting the future. 5 years after David's death, I stood in the pulpit of my own Church Grace Community Fellowship, a congregation dedicated to transparency, accountability, and healing from spiritual trauma. Hope, now 6 years old and starting first grade, sat in the front row next to Michael, both of them beaming with pride as I delivered my first sermon as their newly installed pastor. The church had called me, specifically because of my expertise in preventing clergy abuse and my commitment to financial transparency. They were a small congregation that had experienced their own trauma with a previous pastor's misconduct, and they wanted leadership that understood both the pain of spiritual abuse and the path toward healing. 5 years ago, I thought my faith had been destroyed. I began my inaugural sermon. I thought God had abandoned my family, that prayer was pointless, that religious communities were simply opportunities for predators to exploit vulnerable people. I was wrong, but I wasn't wrong to be angry about spiritual abuse disguised as divine authority. I spoke about David's courage in investigating financial corruption, about the cost of speaking truth in religious communities, about the difference between healthy authority and destructive manipulation. The congregation listened with the intensity of people who had experienced similar trauma and were hungry for leadership that acknowledged their pain while offering hope for healing. The service, Hope ran up to the pulpit with excitement. "Mona, you were really good. You talked about Daddy David and helped people understand about good pastors and bad pastors. Her simple summary captured exactly what I hoped to accomplish in ministry, helping people distinguish between healthy spiritual leadership and abusive manipulation, ensuring that David's sacrifice continued to protect families from predators who exploited faith for personal gain. That afternoon, while organizing my new office, I discovered something extraordinary hidden in David's old desk drawer. A journal I'd never seen before, apparently placed there by Margaret years earlier and forgotten until the desk was moved to my new church. The journal's final entry was dated just 2 days before David's death. If something happens to me before I can expose Pastor Williams' crimes, I pray that Tessa will find the strength to finish what I started. She's the strongest person I know, even though she doesn't realize it yet. Our baby will need a mother who fights for truth and justice, who protects the vulnerable, who refuses to let evil hide behind religious authority. I'm scared about confronting Pastor Williams, but I'm more scared of letting him continue to hurt people. If I don't survive this investigation, I hope Tessa knows that I died trying to protect our church family and our unborn child from a predator who uses faith as a weapon. Love them both more than life itself. If something happens to me, I pray they'll both grow up to be warriors for truth and justice. The world needs more people willing to stand against corruption, even when it costs them everything. Our baby is going to be amazing. I can feel it when I watch Tessa sleep with her hand on her belly. This child will change the world, and I pray I'll be alive to see it happen. But if I'm not, I know Tessa will raise our child to be strong, courageous, and committed to protecting others from the kind of evil I'm fighting now. I love you both. Fight for truth. Protect the vulnerable. Never let anyone use God's name to justify hurting people. Reading David's final words, written in his careful handwriting just days before his death, I understood that he had known the risks he was taking and had chosen to proceed anyway because he believed protecting others was worth any personal cost. Hope found me crying over the journal and climbed into my lap. "What's wrong, Mama?" "These are words from Daddy David," I explained, showing her the journal. He wrote about how much he loved us and how he wanted to protect people from bad pastors. She studied the handwriting seriously, then looked up at me with David's dark eyes. "Did he know about me when I was in your tummy?" "Yes, sweetheart. He was so excited to meet you. He said you were going to change the world." "Am I changing the world?" she asked with 6-year-old curiosity. I looked around my office, decorated with certificates in pastoral care and crisis intervention, filled with books about preventing spiritual abuse, and realized that David had been prophetic about our daughter's impact on the world. Hope's birth during the fight for justice had symbolized new beginnings emerging from tragedy. Her presence had given me strength to continue David's investigation when grief threatened to overwhelm me. Her future had motivated my pursuit of ministry focused on protecting vulnerable people from spiritual predators. Yes, Hope, you're changing the world by inspiring people to fight for truth and protect others from harm. Daddy David was right about you. That evening, Michael and I established the Hope David Martin Foundation for Church Accountability, using the proceeds from Pastor Williams' asset forfeiture and donations from churches implementing David's transparency model. The foundation would provide grants for independent financial audits, training programs for recognizing clerical abuse, and support services for families affected by spiritual manipulation. David's investigation saved our church, but it could save many more, Michael explained during the foundation's launch ceremony. Hope's birth reminded us that new life can emerge from tragedy, that justice can triumph over corruption, that truth can prevail over lies. The Foundation's first project was developing a nationwide database of clergy misconduct that would prevent predators like Pastor Williams from moving between churches without accountability. Too many religious communities had been victimized by pastors with histories of abuse, simply because churches didn't communicate with each other about problematic leaders. Hope, now old enough to understand the significance of her family's story, became the Foundation's youngest spokesperson. Her simple message, that children should feel safe in churches, that pastors should help people instead of hurting them, resonated with audiences in ways that complex theological arguments never could. My daddy David died trying to protect people from bad pastors, she said during a foundation fundraiser. Now my mama helps churches be safe for families like ours. We want all kids to feel safe when they go to church. As I watched Hope speak, with confidence about justice and protection, I realized that David's prophecy about her changing the world was already coming true. She was growing up to be exactly what he had envisioned, a warrior for truth and justice, someone willing to stand against corruption regardless of personal cost. Pastor Williams remained in federal prison, his parole eligibility still years away, but his crimes had ultimately produced something he never intended: a generation of church leaders committed to preventing spiritual abuse, a network of survivors dedicated to protecting future victims, and accountability systems that made religious communities safer for vulnerable people. David's death had not been meaningless tragedy, but meaningful sacrifice. His investigation had exposed one predator and prevented countless future victims. His courage had inspired others to speak truth about spiritual abuse. His love for our family had motivated a movement for church accountability that would protect generations of families from experiencing our trauma. Hope David Martin was indeed changing the world, just as her father had predicted. She was living proof that powerful transformations could emerge from devastating betrayals, that justice could triumph over corruption, and that love could overcome even the deepest evil. The little girl who had been born during the fight for truth was growing up to continue that fight, ensuring that David's legacy of courage and integrity would protect vulnerable people long after our own story had ended. Sometimes the most painful betrayals do lead to the most powerful transformations. Our family's journey from tragedy to triumph had proven that truth. Justice and love could indeed prevail over lies, corruption, and hatred. David's investigation was complete. Hope's mission was just beginning.